I had made that little joke about the Queen had called in 7 minutes. And you know the basis of that joke was the fact that that's how much time the Queen gives preachers for weddings. So I said, the Queen called. And so it was, and I didn't ask for this, but people actually time the sermon. People come out and they're like, it was 11 minutes. And then somebody comes out. And I guess I was faster at 11 o'clock. It was 10 minutes. It was 10 minutes and X number of seconds. So the Queen would have been happy, I'm sure. So, but he still did a good job. He'd done it before, and there was no reason to think that it wouldn't work this time. It was about noon, and he was standing on a curb, of all places in New York City, right on Fifth Avenue. And like they always tell us, he should have gone down the street a quarter of a block and crossed with the light. But he was already 5 minutes late for the meeting, and he had done it before. So he launched off the curb because the traffic, it was so congested that it was barely moving. And he dodged this way and that and edged to the left and to the right. And he was almost home when he saw a flash of yellow to his left, and he looked in time to see the horror on the cabbie's face as he smacked into him. And then nothing. When he came to, rising up out of the dark, his vision cleared, and there kneeling over him was a priest. The man of the cloth was speaking, but he couldn't hear a word he was saying. It was like watching TV with the sound off. And then all of a sudden the sound came on. And he heard the priest say, "My son, do you believe in the Holy Trinity?" And this gentleman, incredulous, got up on his elbows and he said, "Father, I don't mean any disrespect, but here I am dying, and you're asking me riddles." It seems that way at times to us, that it's all riddles, that we have our own language that no one else understands. It's a riddle, and with the world in such a mess, the world's always been a mess, by the way. You may find yourself wondering, what does that riddle have to do with anything with us today, especially outside these walls? Well, people oftentimes ask people like me, and I proceed to give them, that lame explanation about a 3-leaf clover, and I'm sure you've heard it before, about water as a liquid and a solid, and then as a gas, as steam, which only serves to confirm your suspicion that he's got a lot of hot air. And so maybe you ask somebody else, maybe it's somebody who just recently graduated from seminary. And so she gives you this answer laden with multisyllabic philosophical abstractions, and you smile and you think to yourself, and because you're way too polite, you say thank you, but what you really meant was to say, sorry I asked. Well, you can turn to the good book in your attempt to find out about the Holy Trinity, but much to people's dismay, oftentimes they discover that the word Trinity isn't found anywhere in any of the 66 books, least of all in the 27 books. In those old, crinkly, gilded pages, that word doesn't appear even once. But that being said, it is also important to acknowledge that there are hints of it, and there are intimations of it. There is reflection, or early beginning reflection on it. The trajectory is set, but no one has quite figured out the Trinity at this point, enough to state it. I've often found that if you can formulate a question, even partially so, that's the important part. And if you can find, you hope, the right person to ask, you're more than halfway there. So perhaps, as we find ourselves dealing this evening with a riddle, maybe the best thing we could do this evening is to tag along with Nicodemus, because Nicodemus is a smart guy. And I mean that sincerely. He is a smart man, he is an educated man who finds himself drawn to Jesus. And so through the dark he moves, and we're well familiar with the story. I think oftentimes what we neglect to mention, and people like me neglect to mention, is that John mentions darkness, not just because he wants us to know what time of day it is, but in his artistry, darkness also is a comment on the world in which Nicodemus lives, in which we all live. And darkness can take many, many forms. And so he comes to Jesus himself. And Nicodemus lays it on the line and basically says, Jesus, this is what I know. This is what I know. This is what I've managed to figure out at this point. Now the funny thing is, if you and I tagged along, being the fact that we come from a world 2,000 years older than his, We could also, when Nicodemus is done, waiting for him to finish, we could also add, and we figured a few things out too, that Nicodemus has never heard of. We've figured out things like eternal combustion and nuclear fission and DNA and computers and cell phones too. And what are cell phones? You don't want to ask. But anyway, but after we're done, the truth is, in spite of all the things that we know, and as sophisticated as we might be, we are no closer to the mystery, this riddle, than Nicodemus was. And Jesus begins to speak, and we follow. But like Nicodemus, we keep trying and stumbling over words, misunderstanding this and misunderstanding that. But Jesus is patient. And what he sets before us is a God who is in so many ways, so far beyond our conceptions and our assumptions about God. Not remote, not disinterested, not an unmoved mover, not a cosmic buddy either, but a God who is beyond the world, who is not a part of creation, who is beyond the created world, and who nevertheless is beside it in a shrewd, compassionate, wine-making, wine-drinking, party-going, story-telling carpenter, and who is beside and within that world, who in unseen waves moves over the landscape of our own hearts, Jesus says, the way the wind howls over the prairies, reshaping and making us new, working in us those things that Paul later on calls the fruits of the Spirit. For all the knowledge that Nicodemus had accrued over the years, for all the things that you and I have come to know, the riddle of God remains a riddle until God lets us know who God really is. God lets us know who God is in the story of Israel and in the church's ongoing experience. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is not an attempt at some kind of new math, 3 in 1 and 1 in 3, but it is a way in which to bear witness to the church's distinctive understanding of God. Not Buddha, not Vishnu, not Shiva, not Allah. That the mystery beyond the world is the same mystery that stood and stands beside us in Jesus, is the same mystery that lives within us in the power of the Spirit. It is all ultimately the same witness and the same mystery. I don't know this evening how many of you are Seinfeld fans, but if you're not, you don't know what you're missing. But I'll tell you anyway, there's one episode, and I don't even have to watch Seinfeld anymore. I can just play him in my mind. I know tracks of dialogue. I've got that kind of time. But nevertheless, somebody is defending this crafty guy, Newman, who is Jerry's arch enemy. And this person makes this impassioned plea and says, Jerry, you have to understand, there is so much more to Newman than you know. To which Jerry responds, oh no, there's less. There's less than I know. Less than I want to know. Nicodemus exhausts his knowledge, finds himself in the presence of one he cannot contain or explain in a definition or a theory, but can only be grasped in faith. He was given a glimpse into the depths of God, who was so much more than we could ever begin to imagine. A God whose name is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. A compression of the story that the church is given to tell to the world. The story of how God made this world in love. The story of how the world, in a sense, staggered on its own willfulness into the dark, away from the light, and continues to wander clueless and lost, of how God came to seek and to save it, to bring it back to the God who made it and who loves it, the God whose intention is to dry every tear, to bind up every wound, to make all things ultimately new. Amen.